Shalom y'all, my dear friends. You know, we just began the Torah a few weeks ago, and the first portion was called Bereshit. It was actually a fairly cheerful portion, the way it began with the creation of the world. Yet, when you go to the end of the portion, it wasn't so pleasant because people were rebelling against Almighty God. We then read the second portion called Noach, which began a bit sad with a great flood, but it ended off on a happy note with the birth of our forefather Abraham. Yet this week is a very joyful week. The portion called Lech Lecha, which begins on a happy note and ends on a happy note. It is all about Abraham, our forefather, who his mission was to spread godliness all over the world. And Abraham did everything he can. He self-sacrificed his life to give us an inheritance, the Jewish people, what he aimed to do. Yet the beginning of the portion is called Lech Lecha, which follows the story of Adam and Eve and the behavior of Cain and Abel and the bankruptcy of Noah's generation and the chutzpah of the builders of the Tower of Babel, those who try to rebel against God. This portion, called Lech Lecha, is we meet one of the greatest personalities of all time. The personality of the one entrusted to introduce a moral code, a sense of purpose, a sense of direction to this world. All about Avraham Avinu, Abraham, the first Jew. God imbues Abraham with the mission of Lech Lecha. God tells Abraham, go. You are to leave your birthplace. You are to leave your father's home. Say goodbye to everything familiar and comfortable. And you will travel to the land that I will show you. And without any hesitation, Abraham and his wife Sarah do just that. They depart from the place called Haran, which is in the region of the present-day Turkey and Iraq border, and they make their way to the Holy Land. Now notice the word that God uses, the one that formed the name of this week's Torah portion. It's not just Lech, which means go, Abraham, but Lech Lecha, which might understand as take yourself and go. But literally, what does it mean, Lech Lecha? Go for yourself or go to yourself. And all the commentaries have noticed this apparent grammatical error, it almost seems like almost like they were curious. Like, why did God say, Abraham, Lech Lecha, go for yourself? He just should have said, go. I mean, what does it mean? Why is it relevant when he says, go for yourself? And we also have another instance where God issues travel instructions to Abraham, and he uses the same phrase. We know in next week's portion, when God commands Abraham to take Isaac up on the Akedah as an offering, what does he say? Avraham, please take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and Lech Lecha al Eretz HaMoriah, and go for yourself to the land of Moriah, and raise him there as an offering on the mountain that I will show you. The Midrash, the commentaries, tell us that, like all things in the Torah, the shared phrases of the words between the two stories where he says Lech Lecha, when he tells him to leave his homeland, and when he tells him to take Isaac on the altar, is actually intentional and not, God forbid, coincidental. For these two stories are of great paramount importance. They mark the first and the last of the 10 tests given by God to Abraham to see if he can be the patriarch of our people. The first is the beginning of the journey, which opens with our portion. The last is when Abraham proves his pure and complete dedication with the Akedah. Bookending and encapsulating all the 10 trials are these two events and the two words of Lech Lecha, which means go for yourself. So to fully appreciate what God wanted Abraham to do, and to fully appreciate what we're supposed to do as Abraham's flag bearers so many years later, we must understand that there's a difference between going, which is Lech, and going for yourself, which is Lech Lecha. As many of our great rabbis have taught us, the difference between Lech and Lech Lecha, the difference between going and going for yourself, is significant indeed. And actually, the difference speaks volumes about the way and the perspective with which a Jew has to confront the world and take his place within it. Because we are all part of Abraham's journey. You and I. And a Jew may recognize Abraham's role in the development of humankind and in the shared Jewish mission of making this world a godly place. But inside of us, we often hear a quiet voice that says, God, come on, why me? I mean, I know that we had a chosen people, but perhaps maybe you can choose someone else for a change? God forbid. Dear God, a Jew says, I know your Torah and all of its commandments are profound and full of meaning. But why me? Would it really be so bad if I, like the rest of my neighbors, could just sit back and relax for once? And instead of worrying about koshering my kitchen or praying 3 times a day when I'm really exhausted after a long day at work. I mean, that's one voice that we often have to contend to. We're human. Another voice raises a different claim. God, why so many surprises? Why do you always have to throw that curveball in life? Why is it that just when I feel ready and motivated to become involved in your work, just when I start getting into it, an unexpected challenge seems to arise? God, what is it exactly that you want from me? Friends, these voices are perfectly natural and even reasonable. And no doubt, a person may have to contend with them again and again throughout the course of life. But thousands of years ago, on the very first day of the Jewish mission in this world, God already addressed these thoughts with 2 little words when he told Abraham, Lech lecha, go for yourself. What does it mean? It means, yes, I have given you the destination. Whether it be the Holy Land to start a new chapter in life, or to Mount Moriah for an act of supreme sacrifice, you know where to go. But don't just go because I told you. Lech lecha means go for yourself, that a Jew must know that by following the path laid out for him by God, with whatever obstacles may come in life, he reaches not only a linear destination, but a destination within. That is how you arrive at yourself. You find out who you really are deep down and what you're all about. Friends, the mission in life is to go to your deepest self, to go all in for your truest self. Lech means go because God says to go. Lech lecha means we go because God says so. And why does God say so? God says so because by going, we reach and achieve and arrive at our deepest, purest, truest, most profound selves. And lest one think that one may reach his or her deepest self via other means, says God, for the only way to arrive at lecha, to yourself, is by implementing and manifesting the divine mission entrusted to us by God Almighty. Friends, no amount of money, no amount of success or popularity, no amount of power or fame can leave a Jew feeling content. For each and every one of us is born with a calling for something much greater than that. Each and every one of us have a monumental destiny, a crucial role to play in Abraham's story, a mission that is so important, a mission to do no less than change the whole world. And not for us is the luxury of self-gratification, because we know deep down in our psyche that if life is to be worth living at all, there must be something deeper to it. And chasing anything else leaves us feeling spent. So the only way for the Jew to lech lecha, to reach the deepest self, is by lecha, going in an ongoing journey that God commands us. Now, many have tried at times in life to evade this deeper calling. Many have tried to will it away, to dismiss it. They say, hey, Rabbi, that's an outdated doctrine. But the facts speak for themselves. Jews believe and strive for something higher because deep down, we believe in God. And you know what? God believes in us. They tell a story years after the passing of the Alter Rebbe, the Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Liadi, the first Chabad Rebbe. Now, he was in Russia, and he learned that the Tsar's government was planning to lay a new railroad that was to pass right through the Jewish cemetery in the town of Hadich. This happened years after his passing. He was buried in this place, in this cemetery. And his Chassidim heard that they're going to be building a train track through the cemetery. So that would be a great desecration. It would be intolerable. So his Chassidim, his students, his disciples, invested every effort to avoid it, to disrespect the train being built above his gravesite. But how could a group of poor Jews in a small town of Hadich influence the decision of the mighty Russian government? Thank God. The Hasidim, his students, learned that there was a high-ranking official who was the minister of transportation, who was not only Jewish, but in fact, his grandfather came from the original Chabad community. The problem was that this official, a very long time before that, he left his ways of Jewish life. And he had a quest to reach high places in the Russian society. And it seemed clear that this type of person would have no patience for the pleas of the Hasidic community to request not to build this train over the burial site of the great Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. And anyone who would try to discuss this with great leaders of the Russian government would just laugh them out. They wouldn't even, and forget that, they wouldn't even get an appointment with him. But the Hasidim said, you must try. So they sent a messenger to the capital of Russia. At that point, it was in St. Petersburg on their behalf. His name was Reb Moshe Vilenker. And he actually knew this family of the government official, and he remembered when they were children, they were part of the same community, the Chabad community. So Reb Moshe, he managed to get an appointment with this minister of transportation, saying, a childhood friend of his wants to meet. Yet with great trepidation, he appeared in his office at the designated time. Yet much to Reb Moshe's surprise, the door opened, and the official, his childhood friend, welcomed him warmly. He greeted him as an old friend. Hardly Reb Moshe even began to state his case, and the man said, don't worry, I'm not going to let the train tracks pass through the cemetery in Hadich where the Alter Rebbe, the holy Reb Shneur Zalman, is buried. He said, but I want to ask you something. You came to my office. Could we have a farbringen? Could we have a gathering together like we used to do when we were children together, when we were studying in yeshiva? And he sent for a bottle of vodka like all Russians do, with a little bit of herring, to make a little spiritual farbringen, a gathering, and they sat down together. And as requested, Reb Moshe began to sing a melody, a nigun. Ay, 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 ay. And as he was singing the nigun, he can see that this official, his childhood memories came back to him, and he was deeply affected. And after a few more l'chaims, the official spoke, and he says, let me tell you, it's been 40 years since I left my home, the shtetl. And I really wanted to go to the big city to see what the world has to offer, to make a name for myself. And before I left, I visited the Alter Rebbe, Reb Shneur Zalman, to get a blessing for my new endeavors. And the Rebbe told me, on your way to the big city, you're going to pass the town of Karlin. And there's another great man, a colleague, his name is Reb Shloimeh. I want you to go ask for his blessing as well. And he says, indeed, I left Hadich and I came to Karlin and I went to visit this great Rabbi Shlomo. And as I stood in the waiting room, I can hear this tzaddik, this holy man, pacing back and forth and back and forth. And I peeked into his room and I saw him wrapped in his talus and his prayer shawl, muttering to himself. And he was saying, Junger man, which means young man, what if there's a God after all? And he was repeating, young man, what if there's a God after all? And somehow, I understood that these words were directed at me, and that's why the Alter Rebbe sent me here. So after leaving Karlin, I went to the big city. And one thing led to another. I was ambitious, and I rose as high in society as a Jew can in Russia. And along the way, unfortunately, I abandoned my religious ways. I left the path of my childhood. But ever since that day, Reb Shlomo's words are reverberating in my mind. Junger man, young man. Maybe there's a God after all. And every turn I take, I just can't help but think, maybe I made a mistake in the path I've taken. Do you see why I could do nothing but fulfill your request to save the Alter Rebbe in the cemetery? Friends, the first thing one must know is that God gives you a path and he tells you, go. But the next thing one must know is that precisely by going on that path, you arrive at yourself and figure out who you are. And this answers the second voice we contend with. The one that says, why? The one who says, why God seems to put so many roadblocks along the path? And the answer is, friends, that finding yourself means not just finding a part of yourself, but it's your whole, deepest, truest, and purest self. And there's no way to do it without a challenge. It's not when a person walks the easy path that his potential is actualized. It's but when he has to face the elements, the blood, sweat, and tears, that he finds his true strengths. As any athlete can tell you, muscle is only built when you overcome some measure of adversity. And similarly, it is precisely those curveballs in life that bring out the grit, the poise, the determination, and the force of our inner character and spirit. Great challenges create great people. Without any challenge, we have no opportunity to become who we can become. And this explains why God made this point of lech lecha, go for yourself. The fact that a person finds oneself by following his divinely ordained mission, precisely when he was testing Abraham. It's at these definitive moments in Abraham's life, when the task of being asked of him was so great, when the sacrifice was so bold, that Abraham's potential was actualized. The fifth Chabad Rebbe, his name was the Rebbe Rashab, he actually illustrates this with a parable of a prince who was very lazy, the son of the king. Terribly lazy. He just refused to make anything of himself. He didn't want to get up in the morning. He didn't want to engage in any productive activity. I mean, the concept of taking responsibility for himself was entirely beyond him. And the king was very worried about his son. I mean, how is this prince, his son, ever going to get anywhere in life, let alone assume the responsibility of running an entire kingdom one day? So the king knew there was only one thing he was able to do. He sent the prince off to a foreign perimeter land without any help from the palace. No money, no credit cards. He sent him to a faraway land. And on the first day in his new place, the prince cried. On the second day, he cried some more. But on the third day, he had no choice but to get up on his 2 feet and figure life out. That was when he figured out who he really was and what abilities he had inside of him. It was precisely this test that turned his life into a life worth living. This is what Chassidus says is the meaning of lech lecha, go for yourself. Like Avraham, like Abraham, we follow the path. And like Abraham, the path is strewn with obstacles. But get up and go, rise to the challenge, and thus you will be a changed person. Thus you will find yourself. For by going as God commands you, find the real you, and leave your mark on your family, your community, and on the world at large. They tell a story about Mr. Yosef Lattenberg. He was the founder of a place called Beit Halochem in Israel. It was a rehabilitation facility for wounded soldiers of the IDF. And he was one of the founders of the Israeli Defense Forces Disabled Veterans Organization. For he himself had been wounded in Jerusalem amongst fighting of Israel's War of Independence. And he was totally dedicated to helping his fellow soldiers. In 1976, this man Yosef, he led an Israeli delegation to the Paralympics in Toronto. Following the games, he actually arranged for his group of soldiers that were with him to visit the Rebbe at Chabad World Headquarters in New York. It's called 770 in Brooklyn, New York. On the appointed date, he arrived with 2 busloads of people. Among them were many former soldiers who suffered grievous injuries a couple of years before that in the Yom Kippur War. The group was ushered into the main synagogue where the Rebbe soon came out from his office and he addressed them. Now, though the Rebbe usually would speak in Yiddish, this time he spoke in Hebrew to ensure that his audience could understand. And the Rebbe spoke about how the Jewish people may be the smallest amongst the nation of the entire world, but how our spirit allows us to rise above the limits of time and space And he explained that even if a person is lacking something quantitatively, it is no reason at all to be downcast. And the Rebbe said quite the contrary. Because he's lacking something physical, by no fault of his own, or even more so, if his injury comes because of doing a good thing, especially sacrificing himself in defense of the Jewish people anywhere, but especially in the Holy Land, this is a proof positive that the Creator has endowed him with special spiritual powers. And this person is not just equal to all those around him. And the Rebbe insisted, for his superior spirit enables him to overcome the apparent physical shortcoming. In other words, he can succeed above and beyond the ordinary person. And then the Rebbe said this most beautiful thing. And he said, for this reason, I don't approve of the term handicapped, which it really suggests some type of being inferior. To the contrary, we must emphasize that this person has been designated as someone special and exceptional by the Creator, who endowed him with powers above and beyond the capacity of an ordinary person. And these powers will enable him to overcome hardships and obstacles which an ordinary person cannot. So therefore, in keeping with the Jewish custom of offering advice, even in areas not quite maybe their own business, the Rebbe says, I want to suggest that there's going to be a name change from the handicapped Israeli soldiers to the Mitzuyana Yisrael, to the exceptional ones, whether exceptional by an act of war or otherwise. And this change in name is not merely semantics, rather it describes the situation in the truest way. When Yossi, the head of this organization, heard this, he said, we sat there transfixed. And he said, I, as a person who spent my entire life in this field, can tell you that the Rebbe's words have been a guiding light for me. He said, I met people who were injured in the worst ways, blinded, paralyzed, etc. And with the little bit they had, these people have achieved the greatest accomplishments as one can imagine. For someone who doesn't know this field would never believe it. But the Rebbe, he understood this immediately when he met with us. And this message spoke to us in a most exceptional way. Friends, there's actually a remarkable letter written by the previous Rebbe in 1934. 7 years earlier, that the Rebbe actually miraculously, he was freed in 1929 from the Soviet jail. He was incarcerated for the crime of keeping the flame of Judaism alive in Russia, that country, which was illegal at that time. And what unbelievable sacrifice, the Rebbe actually, the previous Rebbe, he battled Stalin with blood, sweat, and tears, and he undergoing unspeakable pain, physical pain, and hardships in his struggle, in his arrest, and his imprisonment. 7 years later, after he got out, miraculously, the Rebbe writes a letter, the previous Rebbe writes, and he says like this, aside from the various stages in life, like infancy, youth, adolescence, and aside from one's natural abilities, whether they are average or extraordinary, and aside from one's natural disposition, such as if he's shy, if he's serious, or cheerful, and aside from that, he says, divine providence, God, sometimes puts a person in a situation that changes his nature and actually gives him the ability to rise to new levels. The most impactful experience on a person's life and on the development of his character is when he must struggle for the sake of his values, and especially when he must contend with those that are pursuing him for upholding his faith. And although, he writes, such an experience is full of difficulty and hardships, it is rich in the strong impact it leaves on a person. Ultimately, those days are the brightest days of his life. My dear friends, there's a tremendous lesson here, especially relevant to today's days and relevant to educating our children and students. These days, it's tempting to make things as easy as possible for our children. We don't want to pressure them to do things. Parents tell me we don't want to push the limits of our children. Let's go easy on schoolwork, easy on chores. Easy what we expect of our children religiously. Rabbi, don't push it. We don't want to push our children out of the comfort zone. But if you think about it, there's a tremendous risk in this approach. Without that push, a child cannot find out who or she really is. Without some struggle, without the force to contend with how will a child acquire those values that are worth living for. Where are they going to get those values or learn how to have it? By leaving children in their comfort zone, we're not doing them any favor. It's actually quite the opposite. When we subject our children to the test of life, that is when they will blossom. And someday, one day, they're going to come and say thank you. You know the story they say to children in school about a grandfather showing his kids the caterpillar's cocoon? He explains that soon the cocoon's going to open and a beautiful butterfly is going to come out. The child says, Granddaddy, Grandpa, let me touch the cocoon. But his grandfather warns him not to help the butterfly in any way as it attempts to emerge. Let it happen by itself. But as the butterfly was struggling to come out of its cocoon, the child was overcome by pity, and he couldn't resist, and he broke it. Sadly, the butterfly fell to the ground, and he was unable to fly. The kid was sad. The grandfather explained, Sonny boy, the butterfly's struggle to make it out of that cocoon is actually what helps its wings to develop and build its muscles. And precisely that hard work is what makes it possible for the butterfly to emerge and fly in this world. Friends, this week's portion, Lech Lecha, teaches us that though in life sometimes it seems like a caterpillar, it's a struggling procedure, but that process is the lech. We need the going to our lecha, to our butterfly, our deepest, truest selves, beautiful, flying, divine beings that elevate in our world. So friends, the challenges that we face raising our children sometimes help to mold the people, the children, to become the people that will make this world a better place. Let us pray that God guide us during these challenging days, that we reach a time where there's going to be peace and calmness in this world, where all swords will turn into plowshares, all challenges will not be stumbling blocks, but stepping stones to reach greater heights. And that, my friends, will be in an era when Mashiach will come. There will be no more famine, no more war, no more evil. Only goodness and kindness will permeate this world. May we merit that this happen speedily in our days. Thank you and shalom.